I'm not sure if you like political movies or movies where there's a coup, where there's a challenge against power, and then there's an uprising. Normally it starts with a sense of discontent. There's grumbling and dissatisfaction in the current regime, and then there's a plan to change things, a plan to reorder things. And this is a picture of what we get in Numbers 15 and 19 as we're travelling with God's people. They've been rescued from slavery in Egypt, and they're working their way towards the land that God had promised them. In chapters 15 and 19, there's a particular pushback against both the offerings and the priestly protocol that God had established for his people. Now, it's not particularly clear at what time within the 40 years of their wandering that this event takes place, but what we see here is a discontent that leads to grumbling, a grumbling that forges a plan of outright rebellion against God. And so chapters 15 through 19 are sort of bookended with God's intention, both for how the offerings are to be made and for the role of priests within the community. This is about looking forward to when life is in the promised land, about how they're to function as God's people, living in the destination that he has prepared. But in the middle of this, chapter 16 gives us a picture of where God's people were at with this order. And we see a rebellion, we see a pushback, and we see God's response to it. And so with chapter 15, with the outlining about the laws for offerings, there's particular things that are identified. Not everything is outlined, but it's a looking forward to life in the land. And so from verses 1 to 16, we see that the items are required for the sacrifice. And again, this is a careful arrangement of the various things that God is intending. What is going to be necessary for them to administer the appropriate offerings that come from being God's people, that come from God dwelling closely with his people in the land. And so in chapter 15, verse 17 to 21, there's this sort of instruction about what this first dough offering looks like. It's a recognition of the provider when the harvest comes in, that there would be this baking of dough to utilize what has just been grown. Chapter 15, verse 22 through to 31 moves on to the offerings that need to be made when there's inadvertent sin. The law is to be applied to the way people live in the land, but there's an expectation that even when they're in the land, people are going to fail God's standard. And this is about what the community needs to do when people unintentionally sin. And so we see here what was outlined in Leviticus, this idea of a sin offering, this idea of how to purify someone who by their actions has made themselves unclean. It moves from the unintentional and the inadvertent to the intentional breaking of God's command. And this is particularly framed around the Sabbath. This was much more serious. This was an intentional rejection of God's order. And so what we see here is the significance of Sabbath, the day of rest in the life of the community. This is going to be an important rhythm when they enter the land. To have a day when they don't work is to acknowledge that God provides for them. He's provided for them the rest of the week. It's an opportunity for them to relax, to worship and focus on God and to give thanks for the good things that he's given. Much of these ceremonies and these offerings are all about reinforcing in the community's mindset about how privileged they are to be God's people and for God to live in their presence. And that's what chapter 15, verse 37 to 41 is talking about with the outline of these tassels. Verse 40, then you will remember to obey all my commands and will be consecrated to your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. The tassels were to be a reminder that their life in the land was to be a life lived for God. It was sort of this prevention rather than cure, to try and help people to not sin when they have the option to, but to remember that obedience is the right response to the God who lives with them, the God who has rescued and given them this land. And now from chapter 16 through 18, the shift moves from offerings towards the priests. And 16, we're going to work our way through this key story about how God's people were discontent with the establishment of the priestly caste. Chapter 16, verse 1. Korah, son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and certain Reubenites, Dathan, Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, became insolent and rose up against Moses. With them were 250 Israelite men, well-known community leaders who had been appointed members of the council. They came as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" What we see here is that discontent had actually progressed. God's people here are described as being insolent, that there's a particularly large group of members in God's people who have been caught up in discontent and that they have stirred each other into this movement against God's order. It's sort of more than a protest. This is sort of a revolt where they're standing up against Moses and they come as a group. It's a coup. It's a challenge for the established order. And this isn't isolated. It seems that there's a significant both number of people and particular status of people who are dissatisfied with God's order. They disagree with their position within God's people, and they're arguing for a flatter hierarchy where everyone is able to do every task within the people of God. Verse 4, when Moses heard this, he fell face down. Then he said to Korah and all his followers, "In the morning the Lord will show who belongs to him and who is holy, and he'll have that person come near him. The man he chooses he'll cause to come near him. You, Korah, and all your followers are to do this. Take censers and tomorrow put burning coals and incense in them before the Lord. The man the Lord chooses will be the one who is holy. You Levites have gone too far." Moses has authority, but it's delegated authority. And so he demonstrates that as he says that God will show about how right or wrong their response is. God will reveal his response towards this faction. Moses isn't getting too defensive here, but rather he's submitting the outcome into God's hands. Moses seems confident that the one whom God sets apart will be protected and affirmed, that God's order will be ratified when God responds. Verse 8, Moses also said to Korah, "Now listen, you Levites. Isn't it enough for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the Israelite community and brought you near himself to do the work at the Lord's tabernacle and to stand before the community and minister to them? He has brought you and all your fellow Levites near himself, but now you're trying to get the priesthood too. It is against the Lord that you and all your followers have banded together. Who is Aaron that you should grumble against him?" You hear Moses' response? Isn't it enough? Is it literally too small of a thing that you've been brought near to God? That you were separated as slaves, but now you're being delivered into proximity with God? Why are you trying to get the priesthood too? His argument is basically that they're focusing on what they don't have and not appreciating what they do. You see, they banded together not against Moses, but against God. And Moses says, you've made yourself an appointment with the Lord. This rebellion is against God and his plan rather than Moses and his leadership style. Verse 12, then Moses summoned Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, we will not come. Isn't it enough that you have brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness? And now you also want to lord it over us? Moreover, you haven't brought us into the land flowing with milk and honey, or given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Do you want to treat these men like slaves? No, we will not come." As Moses addresses the other delegation of the faction, Dathan and Abiram, their response is similar language to what he used to Korah. They're now saying to Moses, "Isn't it enough that we've been following you and you've got what you want on every occasion?" But we see here that the distortion in their thinking, that they've totally twisted the narrative. It's really fake news, isn't it? He says, "Well, no, well, you brought us from Egypt," and he describes it as the land flowing with milk and honey. And he says, even though you promised that you're going to take us to a land, you're actually taking us to a place where we're going to die. These guys, in their uprising, have totally become confused. They're distorting the past, and they're not trusting the future. They're really putting Moses in the position of Pharaoh as being a slave dictator, that they themselves, rather than being free people who are going to inherit their own land, are trying to argue that actually life in Egypt was the ideal, and this is a form of slavery. But really what they're doing here is what we often do, justifying rebellion. You know, we get caught up and we know that we're probably muddling the facts a little bit because what we want to achieve is ultimate. And so we either tell ourselves a version of the story that helps us pushing in the one direction, or we tell others so that they would also validate our behaviour. Verse 15, "Then Moses became very angry and said to the Lord, 'Do not accept their offering. I have not taken so much as a donkey from them, nor have I wronged any of them.' Moses said to Korah, 'You and all your followers are to appear before the Lord tomorrow. You and they and Aaron. Each man is to take his censer and put incense in it, 250 censers in all, and present it before the Lord. You and Aaron are to present your censers also.' So each of them took his censer, put burning coals and incense in it, and stood with Moses and Aaron at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Korah had gathered all his followers in opposition to them at the entrance to the tent of meeting, the glory of the Lord appeared to the entire assembly. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Separate yourselves from this assembly, so I can put an end to them at..." Moses here again becomes very angry. He's just fed up that their lack of belief has now resulted in outright rebellion. And I don't think he's particularly upset about their attack on him, but it's an attack on God. And Moses is just fed up. He hands it to God and says, "You arbitrate." And so God says, "Well, Moses and Aaron, you separate yourself from the people because I'm going to deal with them. Justice is going to be delivered, and it's going to be in the form of judgment against rebellion." But verse 22, Moses and Aaron fell face down and cried out, "O God, the God who gives breath to all living things, will you be angry with the entire assembly when only one man sins?" Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the assembly, move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." Moses got up and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. He warned the assembly, "Move back from the tents of these wicked men. Do not touch anything belonging to them, or you will be swept away because of all their sins." So they moved away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Dathan and Abiram had come out and were standing with their wives, children, and little ones at the entrance to their tents. Moses here doesn't want to see the wider community punished for the rebellion of a few. And so he pleads for mercy on the wider community and asks God to deliver justice just on these few who had delivered rebellion against him. Verse 28, then Moses said, "This is how you'll know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things, and that it was not my idea. If these men die a natural death and suffer the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about something totally new and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them up with everything that belongs to them and they go down alive into the realm of the dead, then you'll know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt." Moses delegates again his authority and says to the people that God will show clearly his response against their actions. He will demonstrate in something new about how he feels against their response. It will be clear as he demonstrates his leadership of his people. And because they have treated the Lord with contempt, Moses foreshadows that God will deliver judgment on the rebellious people. In verse 31, as soon as he finished saying all this, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, and their households, and all those associated with Korah, together with their possessions. They went down alive into the realm of the dead with everything they owned. The earth closed over them, and they perished and were gone from the community. At their cries, all the Israelites around them fled, shouting, "The earth is going to swallow us too." And fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 who were offering the incense. And God responds as only God can, in a sort of miraculous and timely fashion. He's working within the laws of nature, that the ground opens up, that they are swallowed and consumed, that they literally go into the place of the dead as we bury people in the ground. There's a sense that this is the result of rebellion, death. And as Moses has handed control over to God, God has clearly shown that he is leading his people. And so this rebellion in chapter 16, verses 1 through 35, shows the movement from grumbling towards a formulated coup. That rebellion can just be a rejection of God's plan, and it can be an establishment and a forcing of our own agenda. There can be a real discontent about our place within God's people. There can be this obsession with what we can't do or with what others have, that we fail to play our role and appreciate what we have. And so from verse 36, the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, to remove the censers from the charred remains and scatter the coals some distance away, for the censers are holy. The censers of the men who sinned at the cost of their lives. Hammer the censers into sheets to overlay the altar, for they were presented before the Lord and have become holy. Let them be a sign to the Israelites." God doesn't rejoice in judgment. He wants people to learn the lessons. This rebellion led to God's judgment, and so a memorial is to be established so that the people remember what happened and don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Verse 39, so Eleazar the priest collected the bronze censers brought by those who had been burned to death, and he had them hammered out to overlay the altar, as the Lord directed him through Moses. This was to remind the Israelites that no one except a descendant of Aaron should come to burn incense before the Lord, or he would become like Korah and his followers. This instruction is so that God's people would remember God's order, that they would trust him by playing their role within the people, that they would comply with the orders and the protocols that he's established. But we see soon that they haven't learnt their lesson. Verse 41, the next day the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. "You have killed the Lord's people," they said. But when the assembly gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron and turned toward the tent of meeting, suddenly the cloud covered it and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then Moses and Aaron went to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord said to Moses, "Get away from this assembly so I can put an end to them at once." And they fell face down. Now these are the people whom Moses has literally rescued. Remember how he's just pleaded with them? Remember how he's pleaded with God to just bring judgment against that rebellious cohort, to spare the rest of the community. Rather than appreciating the mercy that they've received, they grumble again. And so they rebel against God's plan and his order. And so verse 46, then Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer and put incense in it, along with the burning coals from the altar, and hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them. Wrath has come out from the Lord, the plague has started." So Aaron did as Moses said and ran into the midst of the assembly. The plague had already started among the people, but Aaron offered the incense and made atonement for them. He stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 people died from the plague, in addition to those who had died because of Korah. Then Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance to the tent of meeting, for the plague had stopped. As God's people continued to rebel against him, as they failed to take the warning signs and remember the lessons from the predecessors, God continues to respond justly. He brings punishment to rebellion. And apart from the work of Aaron in being able to intercede and to halt this plague, to stop the death of all, there would be total destruction. But God in his mercy had provided the means. And again, it's a reaffirmation that the order of the priestly caste is significant. The very thing that God's people were revolting against. The very thing that God's people wanted to level out, to sort of minimize, to not designate as a special role, but that could be partaken by everyone, is now being affirmed. Apart from Aaron, all would have died. Many thousands have died as a result of rebellion. But there is a remnant that remains. And so chapters 17 and 18, it goes through to affirm the various roles within the priestly order. It's sort of a re-establishment. This is to be a key reminder when they do enter the land about the significance of the priestly caste. This is to be a lesson that is learnt, a mistake that isn't repeated. So verses 1 to 13 talks about Aaron's rod. Verse 6, Moses spoke to the Israelites and their leaders, gave him 12 staffs, one for the leader of each of their ancestral tribes, and Aaron's staff was among them. Moses placed the staff before the Lord in the tent of the covenant Lord. Now to verse 10, the Lord said to Moses, "Put back Aaron's staff in front of the ark of the covenant of the law. It's to be kept as a sign to the rebellious. This will put an end to their grumbling against me, so they will not die." Moses did just as the Lord commanded him. The Israelites said to Moses, "We will die. We are lost. We are all lost. Anyone who even comes near the tabernacle of the Lord will die. Are we all going to die?" God replies to the cries of the people from chapter 18 as he outlines the duties and privileges of the Levites. This particular order that the priestly caste would have is to protect and preserve life, is to allow the community to function. Chapter 19 moves into various outlining of the laws that are required for cleansing. And again, this is about making those who have become unclean clean. It's about restoring the community. It's about preserving life. The God's people are to rejoice and be fearful that God is with them, that their God is in their presence, that their holy God dwells amongst them. So what's really going on for God's people here? Well, we hear that as they're wandering in the wilderness, there's this grumbling, this discontent with the way that God is constructing things. There was a discontent and a grumbling about their place within God's people. There was a focus on what others could do that they weren't unable to do. There was a lack of thankfulness and gratitude at their particular role within the people of God. An uprising that was built on lies. They had distorted what the past was like when God was far from them, when they were slaves. They doubted what God had promised in the future. And the significance of grumbling is that it can easily perpetuate outright rebellion. Now, grumbling is something that we can easily become accustomed to, that we can just ignore and not take any notice of. It's something that is common in the way that humans respond to God. When Jesus comes into the world, we sort of see that there's the religious leaders who are grumbling as he sort of starts to confront them. But in John chapter 6, that we've been looking at the last couple of weeks, as Jesus has fed thousands of people with very few resources, as he's spoken about himself as the bread of life, even his closest disciples struggle And that struggle to trust him is shown in their grumbling. Just having just said that those who eat from him will have life, and those who don't eat of him will have death. And many of his disciples heard it. They said, "This is a hard saying. Who can listen to it?" But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples were grumbling about this, said to them, "Do you take offense at this?" Jesus here, with his closest followers, realizes that his claims about being God, his exclusive claims about being the source of life, are offensive. They do establish a particular order, that he has a role as Saviour that no one else is qualified for. It designates him to be able to do things that no one else can. It requires everyone else to respond to him with praise and worship because of who he is. And now we see following this response in verse 66, after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So Jesus said to the 12, "Do you want to go away as well?" You see, Jesus' claims of offering life require that we submit to him, that we recognize that he is the elevated one, that he is different to us, that trusting in him means that we surrender decisions to him, that we place and order our life where he establishes us rather than when we desire. As Jesus challenges his disciples about their faith, we hear their response. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." Friends, to know God is to be challenged by God. To trust him is to elevate him above ourselves. It means that we surrender. It means that there are possibilities that we close off as we walk by faith rather than establishing our own plans. This is offensive to our world that elevates the individual, to our worldview around that esteems that everyone can be whatever they want to be. Friends, Jesus is establishing life. He promises to be near to us. He gives us a particular role to play. He's prepared good works for us to do in this world that will demonstrate and be the platform by which we trust him. And it won't always be clear. There'll be seasons in our life where we too feel like we're walking in the wilderness, where we will get a sense that there's a discontent in our soul, where we will start to grumble against God. We'll become jealous of what others have, the opportunities that are created for them. We'll be ungrateful about the things that we have and also the place that we find ourselves in God's purposes. There is a great danger here if we don't learn from the lessons of the past, if we don't remember the trajectory of dissatisfaction progressing to grumbling, to leading to outright rebellion that is countered by God with just punishment. Friends, this is why Jesus came into the world, as God's act of mercy, to rescue us from ourselves, to preserve us from deserved punishment, and to ensure life. Friends, the challenge for us is to walk by faith, to trust that God will be faithful to his promises. And remember, the key discontent of the people here was that God being near to them wasn't enough. They wanted everyone's life to look the same, to everyone to be free to do whatever they wanted. They doubted that God's plan was good. And friends, that manifests in our life too. When there's no money in the bank and we can't see how the future plays out, that rather than trusting in God's provision, we can turn to lies and deceit, fraudulent behaviour. When our relationships aren't established as we would like, rather than trusting in God's provision for our needs, for our desires to have a spouse, we go about hatching our own plan so that we can have what we want. It manifests within church communities when we feel like we're not being appreciated or heard or involved, that we grumble, that we develop an uprising, that we slander and tear people down, or we just leave and find another church where we can get what we want. Friends, the great danger for us, all of us, is to place ourselves at the centre. But here we need to see that that is actually the greatest act of rebellion. Jesus is the one who has come, and he has the words that are of eternal life. His words, he himself as the Word of God, is life. When we place ourselves at his feet, when we surrender ourselves to him, when we do the good works that he's prepared in advance for us to do, and we play our part within God's people, it's at that point that we see his goodness, that we can appreciate that he is near. It's actually in the seasons of life when we don't have the very thing that we think we most desperately need, that we can actually appreciate what we have, which is God with us, by his Spirit in us. So friends, let's be a community that doesn't just allow grumbling to perpetuate, that doesn't just affirm that everyone has the ability to do whatever they want. But let's be a community who is encouraging each other with our place within God's people, realizing that our place will form a different expression to others, but when we are working together, surrendering ourselves to Jesus, that we together can delight that he is with us. When we can see the way that he's using particular people for the progression of his plan, we can delight that his purposes are good, and that we can walk by faith, not in grumbling.